You never really find out who people are when everything is going right. You find out in the 11 minutes after someone decides you don't belong. The automatic doors slid open with a gentle whisper as Sergeant Marcus Hayes stepped into Terminal B, carrying nothing more than a weathered olive-green duffel bag over one shoulder and the quiet exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. His Navy SEAL dress uniform was neatly pressed despite the long flight, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every insignia earned the hard way. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the travelers rushing past beneath the bright airport lights. Families hurried toward baggage claim with excited children. Business travelers balanced coffee cups and laptops while checking departure boards. Vacationers laughed over oversized suitcases covered in colorful stickers. Marcus barely noticed any of them. His thoughts were fixed on a single destination nearly 900 miles away, where his mother was waiting in a small house outside Norfolk, Virginia. She thought he would arrive tomorrow afternoon. He planned to surprise her tonight. It had been almost 3 years since they had shared dinner at the same table. 3 years of classified deployments, silent departures, and brief phone calls that never answered the questions she wanted to ask. In his jacket pocket rested a folded birthday card he had forgotten to mail before leaving overseas. He smiled faintly at the thought of handing it to her in person instead. The overhead speakers announced another boarding call as Marcus adjusted the strap of his duffel and followed the signs toward the connecting security checkpoint. The bag looked ordinary enough, faded around the edges with years of use, but his grip never loosened. Every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the digital clock hanging above the terminal entrance. 4:19 p.m. He silently calculated the time. If everything stayed on schedule, he would make his connection with room to spare. 4 steps later, a sharp voice cut through the steady rhythm of rolling luggage. "Sir, stop right there." Marcus turned calmly. 2 uniformed police officers approached with measured confidence, their expressions unreadable beneath the bright white lights reflecting off the polished floor. The taller officer, Daniel Brooks, studied Marcus from head to toe before letting his eyes settle on the duffel bag. His partner remained several feet behind, already resting one hand near his radio. Around them, conversation softened. Curious glances drifted toward the unexpected interruption. Marcus kept his hands visible and offered a polite nod. "Afternoon, officers." Brooks returned neither the greeting nor the smile. "Where are you coming from?" Marcus answered simply. "Overseas." "Military?" "Yes, sir." Brooks' gaze lingered on the uniform a moment longer before shifting back to the bag. "Mind telling me what's inside?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "Personal belongings and government property that requires proper authorization before inspection." Something almost invisible changed in Brooks' expression. It wasn't anger. It was suspicion settling into certainty. He stepped closer, set the bag on the floor. Marcus obeyed without hesitation. He lowered the duffel carefully onto the polished tile, almost gently, before stepping back with both hands relaxed at his sides. Travelers began slowing as they passed. A woman pulling a carry-on whispered something to her husband. A teenager subtly lifted his phone. Somewhere nearby, a coffee grinder hummed while boarding announcements continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Brooks circled the bag once without touching it. "You said government property." "Yes, sir." "Can you prove it?" Marcus reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. "I can provide identification if you'd like." "Don't move." The command echoed louder than necessary, freezing several nearby passengers in place. Marcus immediately stopped. His hand remained exactly where it was. His face showed neither irritation nor fear, only disciplined patience refined through years of situations far more dangerous than this one. Another glance found the terminal clock. 4:21 p.m. 2 minutes had already disappeared. Brooks spoke into his shoulder microphone, requesting additional support while never taking his eyes off. "Marcus." Within moments, another airport officer appeared from across the concourse. People who had intended to continue toward their gates slowed almost instinctively. Curiosity spread faster than conversation. Marcus noticed more phones quietly pointing in his direction. He ignored them. None of this was what concerned him. His attention returned once again to the clock hanging above the checkpoint. 9 minutes remained, and for the first time since walking into the airport, something behind his calm brown eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. It wasn't fear for himself. It was the unmistakable realization that time was beginning to run out. Marcus remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow and even, while the growing circle of travelers watched in uneasy silence. Years of military training had taught him that panic only clouded judgment, and judgment was often the only thing standing between order and chaos. The polished floor beneath his shoes reflected the bright ceiling lights with almost perfect clarity, making the terminal feel colder than it had only moments before. Officer Daniel Brooks took another careful step toward the duffel bag, his eyes narrowing as if every answer Marcus had given only raised another question. "You said government property," Brooks repeated. "Then you understand why we have to verify that." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." His calm voice somehow made the surrounding tension even more noticeable. Most people became defensive when confronted. Some argued. Others demanded supervisors or reached for their phones. Marcus did none of those things. He simply waited, standing with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to following procedures even when those procedures became inconvenient. Another officer arrived, pushing through the crowd, followed closely by an airport security supervisor wearing a dark blue blazer with an identification badge clipped neatly to the lapel. The supervisor looked first at Brooks, then at Marcus, then at the immaculate Navy uniform that still carried the faint creases from hours spent in an airplane seat. "What do we have?" she asked. Brooks answered, without looking away from Marcus. "Individual claims he is transporting government property. Refused inspection." Marcus spoke before the misunderstanding could settle any deeper. "Respectfully, ma'am, I did not refuse inspection. I said the contents require proper authorization before anyone opens the bag. I am willing to cooperate with every lawful instruction." The supervisor studied him for several seconds. There was nothing aggressive in his posture, nothing rushed. Even his breathing remained measured despite dozens of strangers quietly observing the exchange. Yet Brooks remained unconvinced. "People can buy uniforms," he said. "People can fake identification." Marcus met his eyes without the slightest hint of resentment. "That is true, sir." The answer seemed to frustrate Brooks more than an argument would have. He expected resistance. Instead, he found patience. Somewhere behind the growing crowd, another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Marcus glanced toward the large digital clock mounted above the security checkpoint. 4:24. 7 minutes. His heartbeat remained steady, but the calculation repeated itself automatically inside his mind. 7 minutes until something important could no longer wait. Brooks noticed the glance immediately. "Why do you keep looking at the clock?" Marcus hesitated for the briefest moment. "Because time matters today." "For what?" Brooks asked. Marcus answered carefully. "I cannot explain that here." The response drew another suspicious look. Several nearby passengers exchanged quiet whispers. One elderly veteran wearing a faded service cap stopped pushing his rolling suitcase and watched with growing concern. A mother gently guided her young daughter farther to one side while still looking back over her shoulder. The terminal had not stopped moving, but the invisible current of attention now flowed almost entirely toward the uniformed man standing beside the weathered duffel. Brooks motioned toward another officer. "I want that bag isolated." Marcus finally spoke with more urgency, though his voice never rose above a respectful tone. "Sir, I strongly recommend that the bag remain exactly where it is until authorized personnel arrive." "Authorized by whom?" Brooks asked sharply. Marcus looked at him with the same calm expression. "They already know where I am supposed to be." Brooks folded his arms. "Interesting answer." Marcus said nothing more. He had learned long ago that some conversations only became louder when too many words were added. Silence often carried more discipline than explanation. The supervisor looked between both men, sensing that neither intended to change course. She quietly instructed another airport employee to redirect foot traffic around the area, creating a wider space between Marcus and the steadily growing audience. The polished terminal suddenly felt strangely quiet despite hundreds of travelers continuing toward distant gates. The soft rolling of luggage wheels blended with distant conversations until every ordinary sound seemed unusually sharp. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly toward the duffel bag resting exactly where he had placed it. The worn canvas carried scratches collected from years of deployments, airports, helicopters, and military transport flights. To everyone else, it looked like nothing more than an old piece of luggage. To him, it represented a responsibility that extended far beyond his own reputation. When he looked back up, his eyes found the clock again. 4:26. 5 minutes remained. For the first time, the airport security supervisor noticed that every glance Marcus made toward the time carried neither fear nor impatience. It carried concern. Quiet, controlled concern for something much larger than himself. She looked at Officer Brooks and spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear. Maybe we should find out who is expecting him before we assume anything. Brooks remained silent for several long seconds, still studying Marcus with guarded skepticism. Then his radio suddenly crackled with an incoming transmission. Every officer instinctively turned toward the sound, but Marcus did not move at all. He simply watched the clock continue counting forward, one silent minute at a time. The radio transmission came through in a burst of static that briefly silenced everyone closest to Officer Daniel Brooks. He pressed a finger against his earpiece, listening carefully while his expression shifted from quiet confidence to visible uncertainty. "Repeat that," he said. "I need confirmation." The reply was too faint for anyone else to hear, but it was enough to make him glance back toward Marcus before speaking again. "Negative. He is still here." The transmission ended as suddenly as it had begun. Brooks lowered his hand without offering an explanation. The airport security supervisor noticed the hesitation immediately. "What was that about?" she asked. Brooks shook his head. "Dispatch is checking something. Nothing confirmed yet." Marcus remained silent. He had no intention of interrupting the process, even though every passing second tightened the invisible deadline inside his mind. The large terminal clock advanced again. 4:27. 4 minutes remained. A young airport employee quietly wheeled a row of empty luggage carts past the growing crowd before slowing to watch from a distance. Travelers continued whispering among themselves. Some assumed the officers had stopped a dangerous suspect. Others believed the uniform itself must have been fake. A few looked at Marcus with sympathy, while others simply waited for answers. The uncertainty spread through the terminal like a sudden change in weather. The security supervisor stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice enough that only he could hear. "Sergeant Hayes, if there is something that can help us understand this situation, now would be the time." Marcus met her eyes respectfully. "Ma'am, I want to help. I truly do. But I also gave my word that certain information would only be shared with authorized personnel." She studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his answer. No attempt to hide behind military status. Only the steady discipline of someone who understood that promises sometimes carried consequences larger than personal comfort. Brooks folded his arms again. "Convenient." Marcus did not react to the remark. Instead, he looked briefly toward a family walking past the edge of the scene. A little boy wearing a toy camouflage backpack stopped beside his father and stared at Marcus with wide eyes. The child smiled and gave a small salute, probably copied from a movie or television show. Marcus returned the gesture with the slightest nod of respect before the father gently guided the boy toward their departure gate. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but the security supervisor noticed it. So did several nearby passengers. Whatever they believed about the situation, the exchange felt genuine. Brooks seemed unaffected. "Identification," he said firmly. Slowly, Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Keeping every movement deliberate, he reached into the inside pocket of his dress jacket and removed a military identification wallet. Before opening it, he paused. "May I?" Brooks answered with a short nod. Marcus carefully unfolded the leather holder and presented the identification without stepping forward. Brooks accepted it, studying every detail under the bright terminal lighting. The photograph matched perfectly. The name matched the boarding pass clipped inside Marcus's jacket pocket. The identification appeared authentic in every visible way. Still, Brooks continued examining it as though searching for something that did not belong. "This could still be counterfeit," he said after a long silence. The supervisor looked surprised. "It looks legitimate." "Looks can be deceiving," Brooks replied. Marcus quietly answered, "That is why verification exists." Again, the calm response landed harder than an argument ever could have. Brooks handed the identification to another officer for electronic verification while maintaining his position near the duffel bag. The surrounding crowd had grown larger despite airport employees politely encouraging travelers to continue toward their gates. Human curiosity often proved stronger than schedules. Somewhere above them, sunlight filtered through the enormous glass windows overlooking the runway, painting long reflections across the polished floor. Outside, an airliner slowly taxied toward departure, its engines humming with quiet power. Marcus watched it disappear beyond the terminal windows before looking once more at the clock. 4:28. 3 minutes remained. His breathing stayed even, but the urgency inside him deepened. Not because he feared arrest. Not because strangers were recording him with their phones. Those things could be explained later. What could not be recovered was lost time. The officer holding Marcus's identification suddenly looked down at the verification screen in his handheld device. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. He checked the information again, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that carried more questions than answers. Before he could speak, another radio call interrupted the silence. This time the voice coming through sounded far more urgent. Every officer nearby instinctively focused on the transmission. The supervisor extended her hand toward the radio, asking for clarification, while Brooks listened without saying a word. Marcus stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, shoulders straight, eyes calm, as the terminal clock quietly moved toward the next minute, and the atmosphere around him shifted in a way that no one present could yet fully understand. The second radio transmission ended with a brief burst of static, but the silence that followed carried far more weight than the words themselves. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly lowered the radio from his shoulder without speaking. The airport security supervisor watched him closely, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Around them, the crowd had grown even larger despite repeated announcements asking passengers not to gather near the checkpoint. Rolling suitcases continued moving through the terminal, boarding calls echoed from distant gates, and coffee machines hissed from nearby cafes. Yet the center of the concourse seemed frozen inside its own pocket of time. Marcus Hayes stood exactly where he had been instructed to remain, his polished shoes planted firmly on the bright tile floor, his weathered duffel bag resting several feet away. The digital clock above the checkpoint changed once again. 4:29. 2 minutes remained. Brooks finally looked back toward Marcus. His voice stayed firm, but a trace of uncertainty had begun creeping beneath the authority. Dispatch found your military records. Marcus answered quietly. I expected they would. Brooks continued studying him. Your service history is verified. Several nearby travelers exchanged surprised looks. The elderly veteran wearing the faded service cap folded his arms with quiet satisfaction, while the young airport employee pushing luggage carts whispered something to a coworker standing beside him. The security supervisor allowed herself a small breath of relief. Then that settles at least part of this. Brooks did not nod. Instead, he shifted his attention back toward the duffel bag. It settles who he is. It does not settle what is inside that bag. Marcus remained respectful. Sir, I understand your responsibility. I only ask that you allow the appropriate people to arrive before anyone attempts to access it. Brooks answered immediately. You keep saying someone is coming. Yes, sir. Who? Marcus paused for only a heartbeat. People expecting me. Brooks exhaled slowly, clearly losing patience with answers that remained technically cooperative while revealing almost nothing. The supervisor stepped between them before the conversation hardened any further. Officer Brooks, we have already confirmed his identity. Perhaps we should contact military authorities directly before taking another step. Brooks glanced toward the clock, then toward the steadily growing audience surrounding the scene. Phones remained quietly raised. Every decision now carried dozens of witnesses. If there is nothing dangerous in that bag, Brooks said, there should not be a problem waiting for our explosives team. Marcus answered with complete honesty. There is no danger to anyone here. My concern is not safety. My concern is timing. The words lingered in the air. Timing. Not danger. Not himself. Timing. The supervisor noticed something she had overlooked until that moment. Throughout the entire encounter, Marcus had never once asked to leave. He had never demanded special treatment. He had never argued about being delayed. His only consistent concern had been the clock. She quietly followed his gaze toward the large digital display mounted above the terminal. For 29 and 38 seconds. Less than 2 minutes remained. Sergeant Hayes, she asked gently, If these next 2 minutes matter so much, tell me why. Marcus looked directly at her. For the first time, genuine regret crossed his face. Ma'am, if I answer that question before the people responsible arrive, I break a promise that was made long before I entered this airport. His voice carried no mystery for dramatic effect. It carried the quiet burden of someone protecting responsibilities that extended beyond public understanding. The supervisor believed him. Brooks remained unconvinced. He motioned toward another officer. Move the bag into the secondary inspection room. Marcus took a slow breath. It was the first visible sign that the situation had reached a line he hoped would never be crossed. Officer Brooks, he said calmly, I respectfully ask you not to do that. Why? Brooks asked. Because once that bag leaves this floor, events will become much more complicated than they need to be. The answer only deepened Brooks's suspicion. He stepped toward the duffel himself, reaching for the worn shoulder strap. Marcus did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched with quiet concern, his eyes drifting once more toward the clock. 4:29 and 52 seconds. The terminal seemed to grow strangely still. Even passengers who knew nothing about the situation sensed that something important was about to happen. Outside the enormous windows, the afternoon sun reflected across the runway in bright bands of gold. Inside, every ticking second echoed inside Marcus's mind with relentless precision. Then, just as Brooks's hand came within inches of the duffel, a deep mechanical rumble rolled through the glass walls of the terminal. It did not sound like a commercial aircraft. It was lower, heavier, unmistakably different. Heads turned almost in unison toward the runway as several dark government vehicles appeared beyond the security perimeter, moving with deliberate speed toward a restricted access gate. Marcus looked through the glass without the slightest hint of surprise. He quietly exhaled for the first time since entering the airport. The clock changed to 4:30 exactly. 11 minutes had passed. For several long seconds, nobody inside the terminal spoke. Every pair of eyes shifted from the line of dark vehicles approaching the restricted gate outside the enormous glass windows back to Marcus Hayes, who stood with the same calm posture he had maintained since the first officer stopped him. He did not smile. He did not look relieved. Instead, he simply adjusted his breathing and rested his attention on the approaching convoy, as though he had been expecting that exact moment all along. Officer Daniel Brooks followed the movement outside with narrowed eyes before speaking into his radio again. Control, identify those vehicles approaching the East Service entrance. Static answered first. Then came a hurried reply that immediately erased the remaining confidence from his expression. Repeat that, Brooks said quietly. The airport security supervisor watched him carefully. What is it? Brooks hesitated. The gate was opened under federal authorization. Before anyone could ask another question, the convoy rolled through the secured entrance without slowing. Several black sport utility vehicles stopped with remarkable precision beside a service access corridor normally hidden from public view. Their doors opened almost simultaneously. Men and women in dark business attire stepped out alongside uniformed military personnel whose movements were calm, organized, and unmistakably purposeful. None of them appeared rushed. They moved with the confidence of people who already knew exactly where they were going. A murmur spread across the terminal. Travelers lowered their phones only to lift them again seconds later, sensing that the situation was changing in ways no one had anticipated. The elderly veteran quietly removed his cap and held it against his chest without taking his eyes off Marcus. Even the airport employees standing behind the security desk exchanged uncertain glances. The supervisor's own radio suddenly came alive. Stand by for senior federal representatives entering the terminal. She blinked. Senior representatives? Affirmative. Clear the immediate area and maintain current positions. Brooks looked from the radio to Marcus, then back toward the approaching convoy. The certainty that had guided every decision during the previous 11 minutes was beginning to dissolve. Marcus remained exactly where he was. His attention drifted briefly toward his weathered duffel bag before returning to the entrance doors now opening automatically. Cool afternoon air swept into the terminal as 6 officials entered in coordinated formation. At their center walked a composed woman in a dark navy blazer carrying a secure credential wallet. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back, and her steady pace reflected years of leadership rather than urgency. She scanned the terminal only once before her eyes settled immediately on Marcus. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward him. The officers instinctively stepped aside, unsure whether to intervene. The woman stopped a few feet from Marcus and offered a respectful nod. "Sergeant Hayes." Marcus returned the nod. "Ma'am." The exchange lasted barely a second, yet everyone nearby sensed that these two already knew one another. She turned toward the airport security supervisor first. "I am Captain Olivia Turner. I appreciate your cooperation." She then faced Officer Brooks. "Who is responsible for delaying Sergeant Hayes?" Brooks straightened instinctively. "That would be me, ma'am. We were conducting a lawful security investigation." Captain Turner acknowledged his answer with a calm expression. "I understand your responsibility, officer. However, Sergeant Hayes has been operating under federal orders throughout this assignment." Brooks glanced toward Marcus in disbelief. "His assignment is active?" "It concluded precisely 1 minute ago," Captain Turner replied. She reached into her credential wallet and presented official documentation to the security supervisor, who reviewed it carefully before her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The supervisor immediately returned the documents with both hands. "Everything appears to be in order." Captain Turner thanked her before looking once more toward Marcus. "Sergeant, have you maintained possession of the package?" Marcus glanced toward the duffel bag. "Yes, ma'am. It has not been opened." "Captain." Turner allowed herself the faintest smile. "Excellent." She turned back toward the officers. "That bag contains secured federal materials that were expected to remain continuously under Sergeant Hayes' supervision until our arrival." He followed every instruction exactly as required. Silence settled over the terminal with remarkable force. Brooks slowly looked at the duffel bag he had nearly moved only moments earlier, then back at Marcus, replaying every calm answer the Navy SEAL had given since the encounter began. None of them had been evasive. None of them had been dishonest. Marcus had simply honored responsibilities that few people in the terminal could have understood. Around them, whispers faded into complete stillness. Even the children who had been watching from behind their parents seemed to sense that something important had just been revealed. Marcus never displayed triumph. He never reminded anyone that he had been right. He simply stood with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through every minute of misunderstanding, allowing the truth to speak far louder than he ever could. The tension that had filled the terminal only moments earlier dissolved into an almost unnatural stillness. Captain Olivia Turner accepted the weathered duffel bag directly from Marcus Hayes with deliberate care, placing it into the hands of another federal official who secured it inside a reinforced transport case without opening it. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet every movement reflected years of practiced precision. Nothing dramatic, nothing hurried, just quiet professionalism. Marcus finally allowed his shoulders to relax by the smallest degree. The responsibility he had carried from the moment he landed had been transferred exactly as ordered. For the first time since stepping through the airport doors, the weight pressing silently against his thoughts began to lift. Sunlight streamed through the massive terminal windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished floor. Outside, another commercial jet slowly rolled toward the runway, while airport life cautiously resumed around the extraordinary scene. Boarding announcements echoed. Overhead, distant conversations gradually returned, and the soft rumble of rolling suitcases blended once again into the familiar rhythm of travel. Yet those standing nearest to Marcus remained motionless, as though no one wanted to disturb the quiet that had settled over the space. Officer Daniel Brooks stared at the empty spot where the duffel bag had rested only minutes earlier. Every answer Marcus had given replayed inside his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The respectful tone, the patience, the repeated request to wait. None of it had been defiance. None of it had been an attempt to avoid responsibility. Marcus had simply honored obligations that demanded discipline even when no one around him understood the reason. Brooks slowly turned toward Marcus. For several seconds, he searched for something to say, but every sentence seemed smaller than the silence between them. The airport security supervisor quietly stepped beside him without speaking. She had spent years resolving conflicts inside one of the busiest airports in the country, yet she had rarely witnessed composure like the man standing before them. Marcus did not appear angry. He did not appear eager to prove a point. Instead, he looked almost tired. The exhaustion around his eyes was no longer hidden by adrenaline. It was the fatigue of countless early mornings, long deployments, missed birthdays, and promises kept without recognition. Captain Turner noticed it immediately. "Sergeant," she said gently, "when was the last time you actually slept?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Long enough ago that I stopped counting, ma'am." A few nearby travelers quietly smiled at the answer, not because it was amusing, but because it revealed something deeply human beneath the uniform. Captain Turner nodded with quiet understanding. "Then your orders are officially complete. Your next assignment is to go home." Marcus looked toward the departure board hanging above the concourse. His connecting flight still appeared on the screen, delayed by only a few minutes. Fortune, for once, had decided to cooperate. He slipped one hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and gently unfolded the birthday card addressed to his mother. The edges had become slightly bent during weeks of travel. He carefully smoothed the paper with his thumb before placing it back inside his pocket. The elderly veteran who had watched the entire encounter slowly approached, stopping several feet away. He removed his faded service cap once again. "Welcome home, son," he said softly. Marcus looked at the older man and returned a respectful nod that carried more gratitude than words could express. "Thank you, sir." Neither man felt the need to say anything else. Their shared understanding required no explanation. Nearby, the little boy with the camouflage backpack spotted Marcus again from across the terminal. This time his father gently encouraged him forward. The child walked over shyly and offered another careful salute, standing as straight as his small frame would allow. Marcus lowered himself slightly, so they stood at nearly the same height before returning the salute with complete sincerity. "Keep taking care of your family," Marcus said warmly. The boy nodded with complete seriousness, as though he had just received the most important mission of his life. His father quietly thanked Marcus before leading him toward their gate. Around them, people slowly lowered their phones. Some slipped them back into pockets without posting what they had recorded. Others simply stood in thoughtful silence. The story they had expected to witness had become something entirely different. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about restraint, dignity, and the quiet strength required to remain respectful even when misunderstood. Marcus adjusted the front of his dress uniform one final time, took a slow breath filled with the familiar scent of coffee, polished floors, and jet fuel drifting through the terminal, then turned calmly toward the gate that would finally carry him home. Marcus Hayes had taken only a few steps toward his departure gate when he heard measured footsteps approaching from behind. He turned and found Officer Daniel Brooks walking alone, no longer surrounded by other officers, no longer carrying the rigid confidence that had defined the previous 11 minutes. The noise of the terminal continued around them, but somehow the space between the two men felt remarkably quiet. Brooks stopped a respectful distance away. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The officer looked down at the polished floor before finally lifting his eyes. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, his voice noticeably softer than before, "I owe you an apology." Marcus remained still, waiting without judgment. Brooks drew a slow breath. "I believed I was following procedure, but somewhere along the way I stopped seeing the person standing in front of me. I saw a situation. I saw suspicion. I stopped listening." His words were careful, chosen one at a time instead of rushed together. Nearby travelers who recognized him from earlier quietly slowed their pace again, sensing that the story was not quite finished. Marcus answered with the same calm tone he had carried from the beginning. "You had a responsibility to protect the airport." Brooks nodded. "That is true, but I also had a responsibility to recognize respect when someone was offering it to me. You gave me every reason to handle this with patience, and I answered with doubt." The admission hung gently in the air. It was not dramatic. It was simply honest. Captain Olivia Turner remained several yards away, speaking with federal personnel while occasionally glancing toward the conversation. She made no attempt to interrupt. Some lessons were more meaningful when allowed to unfold naturally. Brooks continued, "When you kept asking us to wait, I thought you were hiding something. Looking back now, I realize you were protecting something. There is a difference, and I failed to see it." Marcus looked through the terminal windows where another aircraft climbed steadily into the bright afternoon sky. "Sometimes people only have part of the picture," he said quietly. "It happens." Brooks shook his head gently. "That answer would have been easier if you were angry. Instead, you stayed respectful the entire time. Marcus smiled faintly. My mother used to tell me that character is easiest to recognize when nobody believes you deserve kindness. She reminded me that someone else's mistake does not have to become my mistake. Brooks absorbed those words without replying. They seemed to settle more deeply than any formal reprimand could have. After a long pause, he extended his hand. I cannot change the first 11 minutes. Marcus looked at the offered hand for only an instant before accepting it firmly. None of us can. Their handshake lasted only a moment, but those watching nearby understood its meaning. It was not about forgetting what had happened. It was about choosing what happened next. The airport security supervisor approached with a warm expression. Sergeant Hayes, I also owe you my thanks. You remained professional through a situation that could have become much more difficult. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you, ma'am. She smiled. I hope your mother appreciates the surprise waiting for her. Marcus laughed quietly for the first time all afternoon. I think she will mostly remind me that I should have called sooner. Even Captain Turner smiled at that. Some things never change, she said. The elderly veteran, who had remained nearby, spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear. The uniform matters, he said, looking at Marcus, but the man wearing it matters more. Marcus turned toward him with genuine appreciation. Yes, sir. Around them, travelers who had witnessed the entire encounter slowly returned to their own journeys. Conversations resumed. Departure boards continued updating flights. Children laughed somewhere near a snack stand. The airport had returned to normal, yet something invisible had changed inside several people who walked away that afternoon. Officer Brooks watched Marcus begin moving toward his gate once more. This time there was no suspicion in his eyes, only respect. He understood now that courage was not always loud, and honor was not always proven on distant battlefields. Sometimes it appeared in the middle of an airport terminal, wearing a neatly pressed uniform, carrying a worn duffel bag, choosing patience when pride would have been easier, and leaving behind a lesson that everyone present would remember long after the flights on the departure board had disappeared. Marcus Hayes walked toward gate C-18 with an unhurried pace, the polished floor reflecting every measured step beneath the bright afternoon sunlight pouring through the towering glass walls. The airport had found its rhythm again. Boarding announcements echoed overhead with familiar calm. Travelers laughed as they reunited with family members, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the concourse. It was almost difficult to believe that only minutes earlier the same hallway had been filled with uncertainty. Marcus reached an empty row of seats overlooking the runway and quietly lowered himself into one near the window. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing left to protect, no classified responsibility resting on his shoulder, no countdown silently running through his thoughts. He simply watched aircraft move across the tarmac while allowing himself a long, steady breath. His phone vibrated gently inside his pocket. The screen displayed a single unread message from his mother, sent nearly an hour earlier. Drive safely when you land tomorrow. I made your favorite peach cobbler. Marcus smiled to himself. She still believed he would not arrive until the following day. He carefully typed a short reply before stopping halfway through. Then he erased every word, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and decided that some surprises were worth protecting. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Mind if I sit here? Marcus looked up to find Officer Daniel Brooks standing nearby, now without the guarded posture that had defined their first meeting. Marcus gestured toward the empty seat beside him. Of course. Brooks sat quietly for several seconds, watching an airliner lift gracefully into the clear blue sky. I have been thinking about something you said, he admitted. Marcus turned slightly. Which part? Brooks smiled faintly. That somebody else's mistake does not have to become my mistake. He lowered his eyes for a moment. I have replayed today in my head several times already. Every version ends the same way. You stayed calm. I kept assuming the worst. Marcus rested his hands together. We all carry experiences that shape our first reactions. Brooks nodded slowly. That may explain them. It does not excuse them. The honesty in his voice carried no attempt to defend himself. It was simply the quiet recognition of a lesson learned the difficult way. After another thoughtful silence, Brooks reached into his uniform pocket and removed a small challenge coin bearing the insignia of the airport police department. The edges had been polished smooth by years of handling. He turned it over once before holding it toward Marcus. Every officer receives one of these after completing field training. I have carried mine for almost 12 years. I would like you to have it. Marcus looked at the coin but did not immediately reach for it. That belongs to you. Brooks gently shook his head. Today reminded me why I joined this profession in the first place. Protecting people begins with seeing them clearly. I forgot that for a few minutes, and I do not want to forget this lesson again. Marcus accepted the coin carefully, turning it between his fingers as sunlight caught the engraved badge across its surface. He smiled with quiet appreciation. Then I will keep it as a reminder for both of us. Brooks looked relieved, almost grateful. Thank you. Nearby, Captain Olivia Turner completed her final conversation with the federal team before walking toward the boarding area. She noticed the two men sitting together and allowed herself a satisfied smile. Nothing about the scene would have suggested they had stood on opposite sides of a misunderstanding less than half an hour earlier. That, she thought, was often what true professionalism looked like. Before leaving, she paused beside Marcus. Your connection begins boarding in 10 minutes. Thank you, ma'am. She extended her hand, and Marcus shook it respectfully. Enjoy your leave, Sergeant. The country asked enough of you for one season. Marcus nodded. I plan to spend the next few days letting my mother decide the schedule. Captain Turner laughed softly. Then I suspect you will be busier than any deployment. As she walked away, Brooks stood as well. Safe travels, Sergeant Hayes. Marcus rose to his feet and returned the handshake one final time. Take care of yourself, Officer Brooks. The officer nodded with quiet sincerity before heading back toward the security checkpoint, carrying a new understanding that would shape every encounter still waiting somewhere ahead. Marcus slipped the challenge coin into the same pocket that held his mother's birthday card. One represented duty. The other represented home. Together, they reminded him that the strongest victories were not measured by recognition or authority, but by the moments when patience transformed misunderstanding into respect, allowing everyone involved to walk away better than they had arrived. The boarding announcement for Flight 217 echoed gently across the terminal, carrying with it the quiet promise of home. Marcus Hayes stood as passengers began forming an orderly line, smoothing the front of his navy dress uniform one last time before reaching into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against two small reminders of the day he would never forget. One was the folded birthday card that had traveled across oceans without ever reaching its destination. The other was the airport police challenge coin Officer Daniel Brooks had entrusted to him only minutes earlier. They rested side by side, two ordinary objects connected by an extraordinary afternoon. Marcus smiled to himself before joining the line. No one around him recognized the details of the mission he had completed, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Some victories were never meant for headlines. Some sacrifices were carried quietly, known only by the people who made them. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the sounds of the busy terminal slowly faded behind him, replaced by the familiar hum of conditioned air and the distant rhythm of aircraft engines. A flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. Welcome aboard, Sergeant. Marcus thanked her with a gentle nod and continued toward his seat near the window. After fastening his seat belt, he rested his head briefly against the cool glass. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the runway in soft golden light, stretching long shadows across the concrete as ground crews completed their final checks. Everything moved with calm purpose. It reminded him of the quiet discipline that had guided every chapter of his military career. Minutes later, hundreds of miles away, a small white house stood beneath tall oak trees on a peaceful street outside Norfolk. The front porch carried flower pots filled with bright summer blooms, and wind chimes swayed gently in the warm breeze. Inside the kitchen, Evelyn Hayes carefully placed a freshly baked peach cobbler on the counter before glancing at the family photographs covering one wall. Most of them showed Marcus at different stages of his life, from Little League baseball to high school graduation, then later standing proudly in uniform. She smiled at one particular photograph taken years earlier, when he had first completed Navy training. Tomorrow, she whispered to herself. Just one more day? She had no idea that her son was already on his way. Back at the airport, Officer Daniel Brooks returned quietly to his post. The security checkpoint looked exactly as it had every other afternoon, yet something inside him had changed. Travelers approached with boarding passes in hand, asking ordinary questions, collecting their belongings, and hurrying toward distant gates. Brooks greeted each person with renewed patience, making eye contact before speaking, listening before assuming. The lesson Marcus had given him without anger had already begun shaping every decision that followed. Nearby, the airport security supervisor noticed the difference and offered a small approving smile before returning to her own responsibilities. Captain Olivia Turner watched her convoy depart through the restricted service gate, satisfied that both the mission and something equally valuable had reached a successful conclusion. Procedures had been completed. Responsibilities had been honored. But beyond all of that, respect had found room to grow where misunderstanding had first taken root. Hours later, the aircraft carrying Marcus touched down beneath a sky painted with the last colors of sunset. He rented a modest sedan and drove familiar roads lined with towering pines until he reached the quiet neighborhood where he had grown up. The porch light was still on. It always was. Marcus walked slowly up the front steps carrying nothing but a small overnight bag. Before knocking, he took one deep breath, feeling the cool evening air against his face. Then he gently tapped on the front door. A few seconds later it opened. Evelyn Hayes looked at him without speaking. Surprise filled her eyes before giving way to joyful disbelief. Her hands rose slowly to cover her mouth as tears shimmered in the porch light. Marcus smiled the same quiet smile he had carried through airports, deployments, and long months away from home. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said softly as he handed her the slightly wrinkled card. She laughed through happy tears before wrapping him in the kind of embrace that only a mother could give. Inside the house, nothing had changed. The old clock still ticked above the fireplace. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh peaches still filled the kitchen. The photographs still lined the hallway. Marcus placed the airport challenge coin beside the birthday card on the dining table for just a moment before slipping it back into his pocket. One reminded him that every uniform deserves respect. The other reminded him why he had chosen to wear one in the first place. Outside, the porch light continued glowing quietly into the evening, while a gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead. No applause followed. No cameras remained. Only the peaceful silence of a son finally home, a mother grateful beyond words, and the quiet truth that real strength is revealed not by the power to demand respect, but by the character to keep showing it even when the world forgets to offer it first.